During the rise of the British Empire, armies conquered borders, ships crossed oceans, and trade routes reshaped the world. But behind every victory, there was another weapon at work. Not a sword, not a cannon, not a musket or a ship. It was propaganda. Through newspapers, speeches, textbooks, flags, and national myths, the empire built a story to convince millions that British rule was not just powerful, but necessary. Propaganda turned conquest into civilization, control into protection, and empire into destiny. This is the story of how propaganda helped build one of the largest empires in history. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for joining this journey into the past. Today, we explore the hidden side of the British Empire, a side that shaped beliefs, controlled narratives, and influenced generations far beyond the battlefield. British imperial propaganda was not just words and posters. It was a system that touched schools, churches, newspapers, laws, and even childhood stories. It convinced people in Britain that expansion was noble, and convinced people overseas that resistance was hopeless. Before we begin, here is a question for you. Do you believe the British Empire was powerful because of military strength, or because it controlled information and narrative more effectively than anyone else? The early 18th century marked a turning point in how power was explained to the public. Between 1700 and 1760, Britain sought not only to expand across the world, but to justify that expansion in the minds of its own people. Competition with France and Spain defined this era. Rival empires clashed over coastlines, trade routes, and influence in distant territories. But while cannons and fleets mattered, so did ideas. Words became weapons. Messages became tools of strategy. The birth of imperial messaging had begun. In coffeehouses across London, conversations spilled into the streets. Merchants debated profits from the Caribbean. Sailors spoke of voyages to West Africa and the Americas. Politicians argued about treaties and naval strategy. Newspapers and pamphlets emerged as instruments of persuasion. They shaped public opinion about expansion, turning faraway conflicts into matters of national destiny. Everyday readers absorbed narratives that framed Britannia's role in the world as justified, rational, and even noble. This messaging was not accidental. It grew alongside the empire itself. Pamphleteers argued that British trade brought stability to chaotic regions. They described commercial networks as signs of progress rather than ambition. France was often portrayed as aggressive. Spain as stagnant. In contrast, Britain was presented as a force of improvement. Headlines suggested that local rulers preferred British presence. Articles claimed that foreign allies welcomed British order. Even when these claims were exaggerated, they gave readers a reason to believe expansion was necessary. Merchants found these narratives useful. Companies with overseas interests depended on public approval at home. They needed Parliament to support protective laws, investments, and naval escorts. They needed investors to trust that risk brought reward. Imperial messaging made distant ventures seem not only profitable but patriotic. Trade was framed as service to the nation. Success overseas became proof of Britannia's destiny. As the messages spread, criticism became harder to express without sounding disloyal or uninformed. The narrative had momentum. In Parliament, speeches echoed the language of the press. Debates over taxes, tariffs, and colonial charters often relied on the same logic. Britannia's presence overseas was depicted as organized and respectful. Rivals were described as unpredictable. Differences in approach were exaggerated to justify alliances and interventions. Small conflicts at trading posts were reframed as moral struggles for the future of commerce. Arguments that began in print returned to the political arena and reinforced decisions already made. This period also saw the rise of imagery within messaging. Illustrations showed confident merchants shaking hands with foreign envoys. These visuals implied cooperation and legitimacy, even when circumstances were far more complicated. Maps did not show negotiations, rival claims, or local resistance. They showed neat borders and smooth lines. They made the empire look like a design rather than a dispute. Through symbols and layout, printed pages turned ambition into certainty. Beyond domestic audiences, messaging reached international ears. Diplomats read the same articles. European governments saw how Britain defended its actions, and they responded in kind. Propaganda did not just shape the Empire's identity at home. It shaped its rivalry abroad. In France and Spain, pamphlets countered British claims with competing visions. This was a shadow war of narratives. While messaging offered clarity to readers, the reality overseas remained complex. Local leaders in the Americas, West Africa, and Asia navigated agreements that shifted with trade demands and military presence. Newspapers rarely captured the uncertainty they faced. They did not describe internal debates about alliances or fears of exploitation. Instead, print transformed these distant stories into simplified versions suitable for the public. Expansion was depicted as smooth. Cooperation as certain. Challenges were softened to maintain confidence. For those living inside the empire, messaging shaped expectations. They learned to interpret local cultures through the lens of national identity. They were encouraged to see themselves as representatives of a system that improved the world. This belief did not guarantee understanding, but it fueled confidence and justified action. Messaging traveled with them, becoming part of everyday decisions and encounters. This messaging becomes a tool for shaping reality. It influences the way they see themselves and others. It shapes their perception of the world around them. By the 1750s the system had matured. Newspapers had audiences in towns far from London. Pamphlets reached inns, markets, and private reading rooms. Messaging became routine rather than exceptional. It prepared the public for conflicts that had not yet begun. It claimed that wars were defensive before they started. It explained conquests as responses rather than ambitions. It framed global influence as obligation rather than strategy. The narrative had settled into place. As 1760 approached, a new phase was forming. A new phase was forming. Messaging could not remain only about trade or competition. The empire was gaining territory that required governance, cultural negotiation, and long-term policy. New arguments would emerge. Some would focus on responsibility. Others on rights. But the foundation was already built. The early 18th century had established a habit of explanation. A pattern of justification. A language of empire. Looking back at 1700 to 1760 reveals not only battles and treaties, but the narrative to support it had taken shape. Readers learned to see expansion as natural. Politicians learned to defend it. Merchants learned to promote it. In this way, messaging became an unseen structure of power. It prepared the public to accept the world the empire would eventually create. The birth of imperial messaging did not end with this period. It evolved, adapted, and expanded across later centuries. But its origins are here, in a time when words were first used to anchor empire to identity. When persuasion became policy. When printed pages carried the weight of ambition. And when global influence began not just in ships and trading posts, but in sentences and stories that convinced a nation to believe in its mission. The East India Company narrative 1757 to 1833. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of empire. The East India Company, a private trading corporation, emerged from that conflict with influence far beyond commerce. What began as a business venture transformed into a political force that directed armies, collected taxes, and shaped the governance of entire regions. In the years that followed, company officials described their actions as necessary for order. They claimed that without their guidance, instability would spread. These claims traveled across continents, carried in reports, letters, and speeches that reached the desks of leaders in London. As the company expanded its influence, it became a state within a state. From Calcutta to Madras, British administrators held authority over courts, treasuries, and military decisions. This authority was often described as stewardship. The company presented itself as a guardian of progress, insisting that its presence offered protection against conflict and internal division. Through official correspondence, it portrayed each decision as a step toward improvement. Critics, whether they lived in India or Britain, found their concerns minimized. If they raised questions, they were labeled misinformed or disloyal. In the late 18th century, a narrative developed that placed British officials at the center of a mission to reform. Artwork painted scenes of noble officers in crisp uniforms, standing confidently over vast landscapes. Literature depicted Indian rulers as unfit to govern, weakened by rivalry or excess. These portrayals were more than creative expression. They formed a cultural foundation that supported political authority. If audiences believed that local governance had failed, then British intervention seemed not only justified but beneficial. This narrative shaped public perception in London. Many citizens without direct experience of India relied on company reports to understand events. These reports spoke of disorder avoided and economies strengthened. They celebrated new infrastructure and administrative systems as proof that the company was building a modern state. But the picture was incomplete. It did not show the pressure placed on local leaders to accept treaties that limited their power. It did not show the economic consequences of policies that prioritized profit over community stability. Instead, it offered an image of progress that left little room for alternative perspectives. By the early 19th century, the Campagna's influence reached deep into the daily lives of millions. Land revenue systems changed traditional relationships between farmers and rulers. New laws altered how disputes were settled. Military alliances positioned the company as a central arbiter of conflict. These changes were justified in official documents as steps toward efficiency. The language emphasized rationality and improvement. Presented control as a practical necessity rather than a political choice. Meanwhile, in India, voices of criticism grew. Scholars, merchants, and leaders questioned the Campagna's authority. They argued that local knowledge was being ignored. They described how decisions made in distant boardrooms affected communities without consultation. But their arguments rarely reached the British public. The company controlled much of the information that traveled overseas. Reports chose what to highlight and what to exclude. In this way, the narrative remained intact. Some members of Parliament began to doubt the Campagna's claims. They requested inquiries and demanded evidence. Witnesses spoke of policies that destabilized regions instead of securing them. They described the pressure placed on Indian states to sign treaties that diminished sovereignty. These testimonies challenged the idea that company rule was inherently beneficial. Still, defenders argued that critics exaggerated. They insisted that without company intervention, chaos would return. Through the early 1800s, reforms attempted to limit the Campagna's independence. But its influence remained. It continued to act both as a commercial enterprise and as a governing power. Newspapers published accounts that alternated between praise and caution. Public opinion wavered. Some believed the company represented the pinnacle of administrative achievement. Others feared that a private corporation should not hold such authority. By 1833, the tension reached a breaking point. The British government passed new legislation that removed the Compagnie's ability to rule directly. It ended its commercial monopoly and placed governance more firmly under the control of the Crown. This did not resolve every issue, but it marked a turning point. It was the moment when lawmakers acknowledged that the Compagnie's narrative no longer aligned with reality. Control and responsibility could no longer rest in the hands of a corporation. Looking back at 1757 too. The story is not simply about conquest or administration. It is about the power of narrative. It is about how reports, art, and literature can shape the world as effectively as armies. It is about how information, when controlled, can direct public understanding. The East India Company succeeded not only through military strength or economic strategy, but through its ability to define the story that others believed. The East India Company succeeded not only through military strength or economic strategy, but through its ability to define the story that others believed. 1833. This period reveals how perception becomes policy. How justification becomes authority. How improvement becomes a language that can obscure the cost of progress. The company claimed it brought stability. Its critics claimed it took more than it gave. Between these claims lies the complexity of history. The East India Compagnie's narrative did not disappear in 1833. It lingered, influencing future administrations and shaping how empire was understood. It established patterns that later governments would adopt. Patterns based on the belief that guidance and control could be presented as the same thing. Schools and the Classroom Empire 1800 to 1900. By the dawn of the 19th century, the British Empire was no longer expanding by ships and armies alone. A quieter tool had emerged, one capable of shaping thought, identity, and belief. It spread across classrooms, church schools, mission institutes, and government academies. It lived in blackboards, reading lessons, and textbooks illustrated with detailed maps. Education was becoming the new instrument of empire, binding distant territories together not with force, but with ideas. Across Britain and its colonies, children entered classrooms where the day began with geography. A map hung on the wall, large and dominating, colored with familiar shades. Red for British territory. Red across Africa, across South Asia, across the Caribbean and the Pacific. Red like a thread of veins connecting continents to London. To a child standing in front of it, the world appeared already decided. The empire seemed natural, inevitable, and permanent. In these classrooms, history and literature reinforced the message. Lessons taught that British civilization represented progress and modernity. Students learned that railways, telegraphs, legal codes, and industry flowed from Britain outward, like gifts delivered to distant lands. There was little mention of how these systems benefited the empire first, or how local cultures were reshaped to align with imperial needs. The uncomfortable realities of war, exploitation, and resistance were often absent. The classroom became a curated world in which complexity was reduced to a single message. The empire brought order. In Britain itself, education served to unify a national identity. Children read stories of explorers, administrators, and inventors who transformed the world. They learned to admire figures who expanded imperial rule, rarely studying the voices that criticized it. The empire became a source of pride. Meanwhile, in colonies across the empire, schools played a different role. Missionary institutions and government academies sought to reshape identity. Lessons replaced traditional languages with English. Cultural practices were discouraged or labeled outdated. Students were encouraged to view British customs as superior, and their own as something to be outgrown. The structure of the school day, the uniforms, and the examinations echoed systems found in Britain. Education was not just teaching knowledge. It was teaching hierarchy. Many students, however, did not accept this passively. Even as they learned English grammar and British law, they questioned what those lessons meant for their own lives. Some used their education to argue for greater rights. Others became reformers or activists who challenged the narratives they were taught. There is a quiet paradox at the heart of this history. The very system designed to control minds sometimes produced the individuals who would later resist that control. In the middle decades of the century, as railways and telegraph lines expanded, so did the reach of school networks. Teachers trained in Britain traveled overseas to apply their methods. Textbooks printed in London arrived in ports thousands of miles away. Literacy increased, but the content that shaped that literacy carried a message. The empire defined progress, and those who questioned it were seen as obstacles to improvement. The classroom became a proving ground where loyalty could be measured by how well one adopted imperial ideals. By the 1870s and 1880s, illustrations and reading primers depicted scenes of colonial life through a single lens. Pictures of calm plantations, quiet villages, and content workers suggested a world at peace. Students learned about trade goods and agricultural exports, but not about who controlled the profits. They read about railways, but not about whose land had been taken to build them. They studied law, but not the people who lived under its burden. Yet for all its control, the system was fragile. Beneath the surface, ideas shifted. Some students questioned what they heard. Newspapers and pamphlets spread information from outside the classroom's protective walls. Missionaries and reformers debated the purpose of imperial schooling. A tension emerged between those who believed education should create imperial subjects and those who believed it should create independent thinkers. As the century drew to a close, the impact of classroom education was unmistakable. Entire generations had grown up inside a narrative that presented empire as a gift to the world. They believed that British rule brought order, railways, governance, and opportunity. They believed it saved people from chaos. What they were not taught was the cost. The loss of autonomy. The extraction of resources. The suppression of identity. The silencing of those who dreamed of self-rule. This was the classroom empire. Not built from forts or fleets, but from chalk, paper, and the steady repetition of a lesson. It shaped how students viewed their place in the world. It shaped how future politicians, soldiers, merchants, and voters understood the empire they served. And long after the 19th century ended, the lessons continued to echo. The classroom had accomplished what armies alone never could. It convinced people that the empire was not just powerful. It was right. By 1900, the red map on the classroom wall remained. But something else had taken root as well. Seeds of doubt. Seeds of identity. Seeds of future change. For those who learned unquestioningly, education reinforced empire. For those who learned critically, it opened the door to challenge it. In the end, the schools of the 19th century did more than teach children. They taught the world how power could be drawn not with swords, but with sentences. The 19th century opened like a painted curtain being drawn across a stage. Between 1820 and 1880, Britannia's expanding empire did not just exist on maps or in military reports. It existed in galleries, sketchbooks, and illustrated journals. Art became a language of power. It shaped how distant territories were imagined by viewers who would never set foot beyond Europe. In oil and watercolor, in engraved prints and hand-tinted illustrations, the empire appeared calm, heroic, and orderly. Through these images, the imagination of the public could be guided toward admiration rather than uncertainty. Painters were commissioned to follow officers, administrators, and ceremonial processions. They recorded meetings between governors and local rulers. Coronations conducted under foreign skies. Scenes of military parade. Horses stood in disciplined rows. Banners fluttered in perfect light. The officers depicted in these canvases were upright and composed, as if carved from marble rather than flesh and bone. Their expressions carried noble resolve. Their uniforms sparkled as if sunlight itself favored their cause. These images told a story not just of events, but of character. They framed Britannia's presence abroad as honorable, dignified, and destined to succeed. These illustrations did more than show the world. They instructed the viewer how to feel about it. In London, galleries welcomed wealthy audiences who walked room to room, observing empire like a distant dream. Newspapers and magazines reprinted selected artwork, carrying it into middle-class households where families sat around tables and absorbed the message. Even those who could not travel came to believe they understood the world from these depictions. In their minds, frontiers looked peaceful, and authority stood serene. But what these paintings chose not to show revealed as much as what they displayed. Behind the tranquil landscapes, there were stories that went unpainted. Famine, forced relocation, and local resistance rarely appeared on canvas. Scenes of disorder or desperation were omitted. Instead, the brush pursued moments of ceremony, cooperation, and triumph. Art became a border between reality and vision, allowing only the curated version of empire to pass through. For artists, the challenge was complex. Some genuinely believed in the world they were illustrating. Others worked to satisfy patrons whose approval determined their future. To secure commissions, they needed to present images that reinforced confidence rather than questioned it. The resulting art formed a kind of visual armor. It shielded the empire from criticism by offering a counter-narrative built on elegance and nobility. To see these paintings was to step into a world where hardship faded beyond the frame. By the 1840s, illustrated journals gained extraordinary influence. Advances in printing technology meant that engraved plates and lithographs could be reproduced at increasing speed. Images of imperial landscapes, regimental triumphs, and polite exchanges between officers and local leaders circulated widely. Millions encountered the empire not through direct experience but through ink and paper. There was no smell of smoke or echo of fear. Only curated calm. Art academies played their part as well. Students trained to capture ideal proportions, harmonious composition, and heroic posture. When these skills were applied to imperial subjects, the results felt almost mythological. Officers were painted with the scale of legends. Landscapes looked untouched and pristine, as if no conflict had ever crossed them. This imaginative world was not designed to deceive outright. Rather, it was designed to guide perception. To shape what questions were asked and which were never considered. Even the choices of color told a story. The skies were often painted clear and warm, oceans calm, deserts golden. Cities newly brought under British rule appeared organized and quiet. In this visual landscape, empire felt not like conquest, but like order. Not domination, but destiny. These design choices were not accidental. They formed a soft but steady current that carried public sentiment along with it. Meanwhile, in lecture halls and private studies, scholars debated the truth behind these polished images. Travelers returned with stories that did not match the gallery walls. Their accounts described complicated realities that were too tangled to fit neatly onto a canvas. Yet these stories struggled to compete with the authority of art. A painting could be seen, studied, and remembered in a moment. A complicated truth required patience to understand. As the decades progressed, the contrast became harder to ignore. By the 1870s, as more voices questioned the cost of empire, the artwork of earlier decades appeared like a dream built to hold reality at bay. Paintings that once seemed triumphant began to feel like artifacts of a controlled imagination. They were windows that looked outward, yet also mirrors reflecting the hopes and anxieties of the society that created them. Through art, Britain built a vision of itself. The viewer was invited to accept, and in believing to accept the narrative that authority was natural, leadership inevitable, that foreign lands needed guidance to step into a narrative that authority was natural, leadership inevitable, that foreign lands needed guidance to step into a narrative. In the end, the art of empire was not only about what it showed. It was about what it asked the audience to feel, to trust, to admire, to accept a distant world as harmonious and complete. The truth was more complex, scattered in experiences that rarely found their way into brushstrokes. Between 1820 and 1880, art became a silent architect of imagination. It constructed visions that hovered between fact and invention. Paintings, prints, and illustrated journals formed a gallery of illusion. And through that gallery, the empire presented itself as it wished to be seen, rather than as it truly was. The Victorian Narrative Machine 1837–1901. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, Britain already possessed ships, colonies, and commerce. What it lacked was a story capable of justifying its reach. Over the next 64 years, a narrative was constructed that would shape national identity, influence foreign subjects, and frame empire as destiny. It spoke to pride and duty rather than conquest and profit. It encouraged millions to believe that expansion was not an act of ambition, but a gift to the world. In London, monuments rose like stone arguments. They did not simply honor individuals. They told the public who mattered. They suggested that empire was built by noble hands and driven by honorable intent. Across towns and cities, schools taught moral lessons linked to loyalty. Children recited verses that tied patriotism to virtue. They learned that Britain had been chosen by history to protect, educate, and guide others. The idea settled early and deeply, shaping generations. Newspapers amplified these beliefs. Printed columns described foreign territories in tones that blended wonder with responsibility. Reports praised British involvement as a force for order and improvement. The challenges of governance were framed as sacrifices made for the common good. Stories of hardship were transformed into evidence of noble struggle. Instead of speaking of markets or materials, they spoke of missions. Instead of acknowledging control, they emphasized care. Within this era, Queen Victoria was portrayed as a maternal figure. Not only mother to her own children, but mother to nations. Paintings, portraits, and public ceremonies crafted an image of gentle authority. Her presence became a symbol rather than a person. The narrative presented her as the protector of vast and varied peoples, connected by loyalty rather than force. In this story, the empire did not expand through strategy or advantage. It expanded through affection. It grew because the world welcomed her guidance. Writers and poets contributed to this structure. They described distant lands as chapters waiting to be written. Invisible hands turned the complexities of governance into scenes of progress. Railways became threads of modernity. Administrators appeared as teachers. Soldiers became guardians of peace. Critical details faded from view. The economic foundations of expansion, the political pressure on local rulers, and the consequences of restructuring societies were often left outside the frame. What remained was a myth of benevolence. Exhibitions and fairs added spectacle to persuasion. Imperial displays filled halls with flags, banners, and artifacts collected from abroad. Visitors walked through these spaces as though traveling the empire without leaving London. Each exhibit implied that Britain had brought order to places once unexplored or unknown. These visual narratives reinforced what newspapers and classrooms had already taught. The empire was not taking. It was helping. It was not claiming. It was caring. The machinery of persuasion spun with growing force. Music played a part as well. They layered emotion onto ideology. To cheer was to belong. Even those who questioned imperial policy found themselves surrounded by a culture that encouraged admiration. Loyalty was woven so tightly into identity. Beyond Britain, the effects of this narrative reached distant territories. Local leaders were encouraged to adopt the language of partnership and progress. Administrators promoted schooling, legal reforms, and new systems of order as signs of advancement. These changes were not always unwelcome, but they came with a cost. Systems replaced traditions. Structures shifted authority. Economies were redirected to serve distant markets. Yet the narrative framed these adjustments not as disruptions, but as steps toward improvement. It described transformation without acknowledging influence. By the late 19th century, this machine had become highly refined. Propaganda no longer appeared as propaganda. It appeared as truth. It persuaded by seeming natural. Through ceremonies, speeches, and photographs, the empire presented itself as stable and moral. In parliamentary discussions, officials spoke about responsibility and guardianship, avoiding the language of domination. The story was clear. Britain ruled for the sake of others. Britain acted from virtue, not interest. Yet beneath the surface, contradictions remained. Trade routes existed because markets demanded control. Military forces remained visible, even when described as protectors rather than enforcers. Decisions made in London affected millions who had no voice in those decisions. The illusion of unity masked the reality of imbalance. The Victorian narrative machine did not erase these truths. It obscured them. It placed sentiment between the public and the world beyond their shores. As the century drew to a close in 1901, the machinery did not vanish. Queen Victoria's death marked a transition, not an end. The story she embodied continued to echo. Monuments remained. Textbooks remained. The myth of benevolent expansion remained. It would take new generations to unravel the structures built during her reign. The Victorian era revealed the power of storytelling in shaping nations. It demonstrated that control does not always depend on force. Sometimes it depends on belief. On the idea that loyalty is not demanded, but natural. The narrative machine turned ideology into identity. It transformed empire from a system of power into a story of responsibility. And long after the century ended, that story continued to shape how history was remembered. Propaganda during the scramble for Africa became one of the most powerful tools of imperial expansion. Between 1880 and 1914, the world watched a continent divided on maps long before it was divided on the ground. Decisions made in European capitals reshaped borders thousands of miles away. British newspapers, politicians, and commercial interests presented this rush for territory as a mission of improvement and progress. Behind those claims, a different reality was unfolding. Words, images, and narratives became instruments that justified ambition and competition. In newspapers sold on London streets, Africa was described as a vast and empty space. Articles insisted that the land was unused or waiting for development. These messages did not acknowledge cities, political systems, trade routes, or leadership structures that had existed for generations. Instead, the idea of an untouched landscape made conquest appear harmless. If a place was imagined as vacant, taking it seemed like filling a void rather than displacing people. This narrative became a foundation for public acceptance of expansion. Maps played a central role in this illusion. Cartographers in Europe created borders that did not match geography, culture, or history. Straight lines stretched across deserts and forests, splitting communities that had lived side by side for centuries. The maps were published in atlases and newspapers. They helped audiences visualize Africa as a puzzle to be assembled by European hands. Each color marking British influence created the impression of orderly control. These lines made occupation seem inevitable, and in doing so, they made it feel legitimate. Missionaries and explorers added another layer to the story. Their journals were read widely and treated as eyewitness truth. They described moments of hardship and discovery, often focusing on dramatic landscapes and unfamiliar customs. These accounts shaped European imagination. Readers rarely questioned what these writers chose not to describe. Established trading networks, skilled governance, and diplomatic relationships received less attention. Instead, journals reinforced the idea that intervention was necessary. The absence of context created a picture that served the ambitions of imperial powers. Government officials and company representatives relied on these narratives to defend policy. In Parliament, speeches framed expansion as a protective act. Britain claimed it was stepping into unstable regions to maintain order. and prevent rival powers from gaining influence. France and Germany made similar claims. What was presented as defense often concealed competition. Each empire warned of the chaos that would come if others advanced. These warnings supported military action, treaties signed under pressure, and agreements that benefited foreign interests before local ones. Commercial companies helped spread the message. They depended on imperial policy to secure raw materials and new markets. Pamphlets promoted the economic promise of African resources. Investors were told that railways, mines, and plantations would bring prosperity to both continents. Advertisements displayed images of progress through industry. The message suggested that economic growth could only occur with European involvement. This perspective ignored local expertise and systems that already supported thriving trade and agriculture. By focusing on potential profit, propaganda made occupation sound like partnership. Schools and textbooks also played a part. In Britain, lessons presented empire as a sign of national strength. Students learned that overseas territories represented success. Africa appeared in illustrations that emphasized landscape rather than society. This early education shaped how young people understood the world before they could question it. The narrative reached into the next generation, preparing them to see colonies as natural parts of global order rather than contested spaces. At the same time, voices of critique did exist, but they struggled to reach the same audience. Reports of resistance, negotiation, and leadership from African communities were overshadowed by the dominant narrative. Many local systems were complex, diplomatic, and functional. Alliances shifted as rulers attempted to maintain autonomy. Some negotiated treaties hoping to protect their people. Others confronted advancing forces. Newspapers rarely presented these perspectives in detail. The lack of coverage made resistance easier to ignore. The scramble intensified as European powers gathered at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Africa was discussed as territory rather than homeland. Decisions taken in that room assumed that European control was practical and acceptable. Propaganda supported the conference before it happened and justified it afterward. Britain emphasized the need to secure trade routes and prevent rival dominance. Maps were redrawn, agreements signed, and borders formalized. For many in Europe, this seemed like the peak of order and organization. For communities on the ground, it was the beginning of upheaval. Throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, reports of railways, schools, and administrative posts highlighted symbols of development. These details created a surface of stability. They did not reveal the pressure placed on communities that did not request transformation. The narrative celebrated progress without acknowledging its cost. By focusing on visible structures rather than lived experiences, messaging shaped an incomplete picture for audiences far away. As 1914 approached, propaganda blended into national identity. Newspapers linked imperial success to pride and security. Expanding territory became a mark of modernity. In this atmosphere, criticism grew more difficult to voice. Those who questioned imperial policy risked being labeled disloyal. Public opinion had been carefully guided to see the scramble as necessary, even inevitable. Looking back, the propaganda of this era reveals how narratives influence reality. Ideas were used to simplify a continent of rich societies and diverse histories. Messaging turned contested land into blank space. It turned negotiations into opportunities. It turned occupation into obligation. Through maps, newspapers, journals, and speeches, the scramble for Africa became not only a geopolitical event but a story crafted to defend it. Between 1880 and 1914, propaganda did more than justify division. It shaped how generations understood the continent. It framed imperial action as improvement and obscured the complexity that existed long before European borders arrived. The scramble for Africa was a conflict of territory, but also a conflict of meaning. The narrative became part of the machinery of empire. Words and images prepared the ground long before soldiers or administrators set foot on it. Propaganda did not end the story of the scramble, but it marked the moment when messaging and ambition became inseparable. It left a legacy that continued beyond the map lines and treaties. It influenced how history was taught, how borders were remembered, and how the world understood the continent. In that legacy, the true power of narrative became clear. World War I and the Global Empire Message 1914 to 1918. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the British Empire faced a conflict unlike anything it had ever known. This was not a distant campaign on foreign shores. This was a struggle that demanded men, resources, and loyalty from across the world. The empire stretched across continents. And its leaders understood that victory depended not only on weapons and industry, but on belief. Posters, pamphlets, and speeches reached distant territories, carrying a message that framed the empire as a family. It spoke of unity and protection. It requested sacrifice and promised respect. Across India, Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, Australia, and beyond, calls for enlistment echoed. Recruitment offices translated the message into many languages. Propaganda showed soldiers of different backgrounds marching side by side. It encouraged the idea that they were fighting not simply for Britain, but for freedom and stability. For some, enlistment offered wages and opportunity. For others, it represented duty to local rulers aligned with British authority. And for many, it was trust. Trust that service would change their future for the better. Millions answered the call. From the Indian subcontinent alone came more than 1 million soldiers. African battalions marched under the sun across deserts and through forests to reach battlefields. Caribbean volunteers crossed oceans to serve as laborers, engineers, and infantry. They carried hope with them as they traveled to war zones they had never imagined. The message that reached their homes promised honor. The reality that awaited them was far more complicated. On the Western Front, colonial soldiers joined the trenches. They endured mud, artillery fire, and the uncertainty of survival. They built roads, repaired supply lines, and carried ammunition across shattered landscapes. In the Middle East, cavalry units from India and the Arabian Peninsula fought through scorching winds and harsh terrain. In Africa, campaigns unfolded across wide distances, marked by hunger, exhaustion, and disease as well as combat. Their labor sustained the war effort. Meanwhile, propaganda continued to flow. Governments crafted speeches that celebrated unity. Newspapers described a global effort in which every citizen of the empire had a place. Illustrations showed maps covered in red, not as a symbol of power, but of cooperation. The empire, they said, was a protector. A guide. A force that cared for the lands within its reach. The message suggested that this war was a chance to prove loyalty and earn acknowledgement. But even as the war progressed, the gap between promise and experience became clear. Some faced restrictions in rank, limited access to officer positions, or unequal conditions. They returned home with medals, yet discovered that medals did not guarantee rights. The respect they had been told to expect arrived slowly, if at all. In India, returning veterans spoke of sacrifice and disappointment. The empire had called them brothers, but reforms did not reflect that language. In African territories, veterans who had served on foreign soil expected political change. Instead, they found systems of control still firmly in place. In the Caribbean, the war inspired new discussions about equality, representation, and opportunity. Service had expanded their sense of the world, but the world they returned to remained narrow. For many, the war had changed the story of loyalty. Before 1914, criticism of empire was less common in public life. After the war, voices of reform grew stronger. People who had traveled thousands of miles to fight for a cause asked whether that cause would acknowledge them. They questioned why the promises made in recruitment halls did not appear in government halls. The contradiction became a catalyst for future movements. Meanwhile, the official narrative remained cautious. Propaganda did not vanish. It shifted. It praised contributions while avoiding conversations about equality. Leaders spoke of gratitude but rarely spoke of change. The image of the empire as a family continued, but the cracks in that image were now visible. Veterans and civilians alike began to speak of the future in new terms. They no longer asked for recognition. They expected it. By the time the war ended in 1918, the empire was transformed. The victory celebrations could not erase the memory of sacrifice. Industrial cities in Britain mourned their dead alongside villages across India and Africa. Caribbean families read lists of names that never returned. The scale of loss deepened the question at the heart of the imperial message. If the empire truly was a family, then why did its members stand on such unequal ground? The end of the war did not bring the reforms many had hoped for. It brought waiting. It brought negotiations. It brought organizations and movements determined to turn wartime promises into peacetime reality. In this way, the First World War became more than a battle of armies. It became a turning point in the relationship between empire and the people who sustained it. From 1914 to 1918, the message of unity brought millions to the battlefield. But the aftermath revealed a different message. One not written on posters, but carried in memory. A message shaped by experience rather than words. The war showed the strength of empire. It also showed the cost. It proved the reach of propaganda. It also revealed its limits. This is the story of how a global conflict reshaped loyalty. Of how belief in a message met the weight of lived reality. Of how the empire asked for sacrifice and was forced to confront the expectations that sacrifice created. Between the posters that encouraged service and the disappointment that followed stands the true narrative of those years. A story of commitment given. And respect still owed. The cinema and radio era 1920 to 1940. By the 1920s, a new age of communication had arrived. Steamships and telegraphs had once connected the empire. But now film projectors and radio transmitters carried messages faster, wider, and with greater influence. Screens lit up darkened rooms and radio signals crossed oceans. Narrative became sound and motion. And with it came a powerful new tool. The empire was no longer just administered through documents and diplomacy. It was broadcast. Cinema emerged first. In theaters from London to Nairobi. From Delhi to Kingston. Audiences gathered beneath flickering images. Adventure stories, dramas, and newsreels depicted British officers as calm protectors in distant territories. Scenes showed order being restored, disputes settled, and challenges overcome by quiet authority. The camera framed these worlds through a single perspective. There was little room for contradiction. In film, the empire appeared stable and certain. A force that brought guidance to the places it governed. Newsreels followed a similar pattern. They rarely showed hardship or controversy. Instead, they presented parades, ceremonies, and speeches that reinforced an idea of unity. The message was consistent. The empire was a modern system that kept peace. Resistance movements were rarely shown, and if they appeared, it was as a threat to order. The tension of colonial struggle was smoothed into a narrative of harmony. Radio expanded this influence even further. At scheduled hours, broadcasts carried voices into living rooms, government buildings, and workers' quarters. Communications described the empire as efficient and fair, guided by law and reason. Even when unrest occurred, radio often portrayed it as brief disruption, not a symptom of deeper discontent. In many places, censorship became part of this system. Newspapers and radio stations filtered the stories that reached the public. News from across the colonies might be edited or reduced. Some events disappeared entirely from the official record. Rebellions were described as disturbances. Demands for independence were labeled instability. The narrative was shaped around reassurance. The empire was not only surviving. It was thriving. Schools, clubs, and public meeting halls played these broadcasts, turning them into shared experiences. In cities and rural settlements alike, people gathered to listen. For many listeners, radio became their understanding of the world. The empire became a soundscape of certainty. Its voice spoke directly into homes, giving the impression of closeness and connection. Voices on the air seemed to speak for everyone, though they represented only a fraction of perspectives. Cinemas contributed to this sense of unity. Imported films circulated widely, reinforcing a single narrative. Costumes, settings, and storylines repeated familiar patterns. A British officer would mediate conflict. A local problem would be resolved with outside guidance. Order would return. These films built confidence in the structure of imperial rule. They suggested that authority was necessary, and that alternatives led only to chaos. Yet beyond the theaters and radio receivers, the world was more complicated. Resistance movements were gaining strength. Activists held meetings, wrote pamphlets, and organized communities. Some listened to radio broadcasts and felt a growing divide between what they heard and what they lived. The films showed harmony, but many saw struggle. The distance between representation and reality widened. Despite that, the technology remained influential. People who had never traveled beyond their hometowns developed a sense of global geography through radio. Listeners in the colonies imagined London as the center of the modern world, a distant place that set policies and shaped destinies. This was the subtle power of broadcast. It did not need to command. It only needed to suggest. By the 1930s, radio networks had matured into a system capable of reaching millions. Carefully scripted messages addressed imperial citizens as part of a single audience. Public speeches emphasized loyalty, duty, and unity. Even entertainment programs carried an undertone of reassurance. The empire was presented as a structure that would endure. Technology became the foundation for a new kind of influence, spreading not through force, but through familiarity. Cinema adapted to the times as well. Larger productions appeared, filled with dramatic landscapes and heroic characters. These films were not always openly political. Yet they reinforced ideas that supported imperial identity. The hero was frequently British. The setting was often colonial. The narrative ended with authority restored. Audiences absorbed these patterns unconsciously, learning to see the world through the lens presented to them. Behind the scenes, editors, ministers, and broadcasters maintained control of information. Global events were selected for relevance. Some stories were minimized. Others were given prominence. The intention was not only to inform, but to guide perception. Broadcasting became a structure of selective visibility. It showed what the empire wanted to be seen and concealed what it did not. Still, the technology that preserved authority also created the first cracks in its foundation. Some films arrived from other nations with different messages. Listeners and viewers began to compare narratives. A generation that had grown up hearing a single voice started to detect silences and omissions. In those spaces of doubt, new questions formed. By the end of the 1930s, the world was preparing for transformation. The empire's image remained polished and controlled, but beneath the surface, pressure was building. Cinema and radio had extended the reach of imperial narrative. They had preserved authority in a changing world. But they had also created audiences who were increasingly aware of how stories shaped reality. The same technology that projected confidence would one day carry challenges to that confidence. Between 1920 and 1940, the empire learned that control could be exercised not only through borders and armies, but through words, sounds, and images. The classroom had once shaped belief quietly. The broadcast era did so loudly, confidently, and continuously. Narrative was no longer just printed. It was aired. It was projected. It was spoken into the lives of millions. The empire perfected the art of presentation. But the world it described was only one version of the truth. And beyond the broadcast signal, another story waited to be told. The Second World War began with a sound that echoed across continents. Radio broadcasts crackled with announcements, and headlines swept through cities still half asleep. For the British Empire, which had spent generations presenting itself as stable, unshakable, and destined to endure, the conflict arrived like a test of its own mythology. The empire that had once claimed dominion over seas and skies suddenly faced a world where control could no longer be assumed. Between 1939 and 1945, the narrative of eternal strength began to fracture. Before the war, propaganda had shaped how the empire was seen. Films, posters, and speeches promised global order under British leadership. Stability, guidance, and protection were central to the story. Citizens in distant colonies were told that the empire stood like a fortress, immune to the chaos of the outside world. But war does not respect illusions. As battles spread from Europe to Asia, the empire discovered that power built on perception could crumble when confronted by reality. The turning point came in 1942. Singapore, regarded as an impregnable fortress of the East, fell to Japanese forces with stunning speed. For decades, it had been held up as proof of British strength. Now it became proof of something else entirely. News of the defeat spread like a sudden wind across India, Burma, Malaya, and beyond. Trust faltered. If the empire could be broken in a matter of days, what other myths might collapse? People who had once whispered about independence now spoke of it openly. The fall of Singapore did not just shift military strategy. It shifted imagination. Across Asia, the atmosphere changed. British officers who once moved with unquestioned authority now looked over their shoulders. Propaganda reels that promised invincibility felt hollow. The empire bled, and the world saw. For millions, this was the moment the story changed. The belief that foreign rule was permanent no longer held weight. Hope replaced resignation. The future no longer looked like an extension of the past. During these same years, Britain faced its own internal struggle. Bombs fell on London, industrial centers shook. And the illusion of distance from global danger vanished. The empire had always relied on the idea that strength flowed outward from the British Isles to the rest of the world. But now the core itself was under attack. The effort to maintain colonies while fighting for survival at home strained resources, diplomacy, and the public's patience. War forced decisions that peacetime could postpone. Every battle demanded a cost. Meanwhile, voices within colonies grew louder. Soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean fought across theaters of war from North Africa to Europe to the Pacific. They saw the world, experienced the conflict firsthand, and returned with questions that propaganda could not answer. They had marched beneath the same sky, faced the same danger, and stood in the same trenches. When the war ended, how could they be told to step back into silence? The empire had asked for loyalty. Now people asked what loyalty had earned. This shift was not sudden or chaotic. It unfolded like a slow realization. Newspapers once filled with confident victories now printed sober updates. British officials promised reform, but reform no longer felt like enough. The memory of defeat remained, even when victories came later. Military triumphs in Europe could not erase the change that had already taken hold in Asia. By 1944, the old narrative had fractured into questions that spread through barracks, marketplaces, and political organizations. Could a global empire survive in a world where nations demanded the right to define their own future? Could authority be sustained when the myth of superiority had been publicly broken? The war was not yet over. But the answer had already begun to form. The 20th century would not belong to empires. When the conflict finally ended in 1945, celebrations rose across Britain and the Commonwealth. The war had been won, yet something in the foundation had shifted. The empire had survived the fighting, but it could not survive the implications. Independence movements intensified. Negotiations replaced commands. The post-war world no longer feared imperial collapse. It expected it. The story of invincibility that once stretched across maps and oceans had been undone. The collapse of the narrative did not happen in a single moment. It happened every time a family learned that the fortress of Singapore had fallen. It happened every time a colony realized that authority could be challenged. The myth did not fall on the battlefield. It fell in the minds of those who no longer believed it. World War II revealed a truth that propaganda could not conceal. Power may command loyalty, but stories command belief. Once belief fractures, no number of flags or speeches can restore it. Between 1939 and 1945, the story of the British Empire ceased to be eternal. It became historical. And history moves forward. The collapse was not only military. It was psychological, emotional, and symbolic. The empire that entered the war cloaked in certainty emerged from it exposed. The story that once stretched from London to Singapore, from Cairo to Hong Kong, had begun to unwind. And once the story changed, the world changed with it. Decolonization and the end of the imperial message 1947 to 1960. The colonial powers had imposed their languages, cultures, and systems of governance on the colonized nations, suppressing their native customs and traditions. The colonized nations began to resist, fighting for their right to self-governance and the preservation of their cultural identities. The United Nations played a crucial role in facilitating the decolonization process, providing a platform for the colonized nations to voice their demands and negotiate their independence. The end of colonialism led to a shift in the global balance of power, with newly independent nations asserting their sovereignty and challenging the dominance of Western powers. The decolonization process had a profound impact on the cultural and social fabric of the colonized nations, leading to a renaissance of traditional arts, languages, and customs. The newly independent nations faced significant challenges, including economic underdevelopment, social inequality, and the struggle to maintain their sovereignty in a rapidly changing world. The decolonization movement paved the way for a new era of global cooperation and understanding, recognizing the rights and dignity of all nations and cultures. In the aftermath of the Second World War, a world long shaped by empire began to shift. Britain emerged from the conflict victorious, but changed. The war had drained its economy, altered its global position, and weakened the assumptions that once supported imperial authority. Across the empire, new voices rose with clarity and purpose, calling not for reform but for independence. In 1947, the moment arrived that would signal the beginning of a global transformation. India achieved independence, and the departure of British rule revealed that the age of unquestionable empire had ended. The old narrative, once wrapped in symbols of duty and protection, could no longer survive unchanged. Propaganda that had claimed moral purpose struggled against the reality of new political movements and the demands of self-determination. Images that once celebrated imperial unity now looked like remnants of another age. A new story formed in the space left behind, not built on ceremony or celebration, but on reflection. In the years that followed, independence movements emerged across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Some advanced through negotiation, others through protest and political pressure. Each rejected the idea that authority could rest in distant hands. Each insisted on the right to govern, to speak, to decide. As nations separated from British rule, they rewrote their own histories. Maps changed. Flags changed. Education systems changed. The empire that had once presented itself as an unshakable structure slowly dissolved into a network of individual states. Britain faced an unfamiliar challenge. It was no longer shaping the narrative. It was responding to it. Speeches in Parliament adopted quieter tones. Words like transition, partnership, and cooperation replaced the imperial confidence of the past. The public watched ceremonies on newsreels in cinemas, witnessing the lowering of old flags and the raising of new ones. What had once been presented as a gift of guidance was now understood as the return of what had always belonged to others. The change was not sudden, but it was irreversible. Education systems across the former empire adjusted as well. Textbooks that had celebrated imperial victories or portrayed British rule as the foundation of progress began to be replaced. New generations learned different versions of history, centered on their own leaders, cultures, and struggles. The legacy of the old message did not vanish, but it lost its authority. People spoke openly of their experiences and questioned the assumptions that had defined the past. Where the Victorian narrative machine had once shaped identity, a new world reshaped memory. In Africa, the 1950s became a decade of accelerating change. Nations asserted their independence through constitutional reform, diplomatic pressure, and organizational unity. Political leaders emerged with visions for the future, informed by local priorities rather than imperial strategy. Britain negotiated the terms of departure again and again, realizing that the sun setting on the empire did not signal failure, but inevitability. The cost of holding power had grown greater than the imagined benefit. The myth of permanence had reached its end. At home, the British public grappled with the shift. For generations, empire had been woven into identity, language, and national pride. Monuments, songs, school lessons, and public holidays had reinforced the idea that Britain stood at the center of the world. By the late 1950s, that center had moved. Streets that once celebrated imperial heroes now felt like echoes of another time. Museums reconsidered their displays. Artists and writers explored the emotional space left behind. Some mourned the loss. Others welcomed the change. The political landscape shifted along with memory. As nations gained independence, Britain sought new forms of global influence that no longer depended on direct control. Alliances, trade agreements, and cultural programs replaced administrative authority. A new identity emerged, one that tried to balance history with modern reality. It was an identity still tied to the past, yet aware that the past could no longer define the present. By 1960, the world that Britain looked upon was vastly different from the one it had claimed to lead. The end of the imperial message was not a single moment. It was the realization that narratives of destiny and duty could not withstand the truth of lived experience. Propaganda that had once shaped how people saw the world now felt like a memory from a distant age. The empire did not collapse in silence. It ended in conversation. In negotiations, speeches, street marches, and ceremonies. Where new flags rose into the wind. Yet the influence of the old narrative survived in subtle ways. It lingered in textbooks that had not yet been revised. In buildings that still bore imperial inscriptions. In political language that struggled to adapt. It lived in classrooms where students asked why the empire grew, and why it fell. It lived in debates about identity, belonging, and responsibility. By the close of the 1950s, Britain stood at the threshold of a new era. The age of empire had ended. But the effects of its message continued to shape nations on both sides of history. Decolonization did not only redraw borders. It redrew the understanding of power. It replaced the story of guardianship with the story of independence. It replaced certainty with complexity. It forced Britain, and the world, to see the past not as legend, but as legacy. Between 1947 and 1960, the imperial message unraveled. What remained was not silence, but space. Space for new voices, new nations, and new narratives. Space for the world to define itself, no longer from the perspective of empire, but from the perspective of those who lived beyond it. Thank you for spending this time exploring history. British imperial propaganda reminds us that power is not only taken by force, but also protected by stories. The empire rose with armies and ships, but it stayed alive through ideas, beliefs, and controlled narratives. Understanding the past does not change it, but it helps us see the present more clearly. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep learning from history.